Week 3, one flesh. This is the gift of God. It's one of his greatest gifts that he's ever given humanity, a gift of intimate relationship between a man and a woman. We've rooted it in the ancient text of Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. It's a gift that promises and has the potential for more blessing than any other relationship we will ever have. The potential of intimacy and acceptance and affection and care, of being completely vulnerable, completely known and loved and accepted, even in spite of it. But it's also a relationship because it brings so much potential. It is a relationship that is able to bring a deep level of pain. It's a relationship that our culture has easily discarded. It's marginalized it. Basically, it's turned this one flesh relationship into a consumable product. As soon as it stops delivering on the goods that we think that we deserve or need, well, let's just trade it off for something that will. Quite similar to my Dr. Pepper just went flat. I got to go get another one. In the sexual expression of this relationship, the part of this relationship that God ordained to unite two people as one flesh. The union, the glue in the relationship has so often been reduced to simply an appetite that has an unlimited menu that we just need to feed. The alternative view often, especially in the church, is it's a voracious appetite that we ought to fear. And I want to present to you today that those things are wrong. That both of those views are wrong. And I'm going to pause before we get into it and tell you that this teaching is at least PG-13, if not R. And so we have I'm scanning the crowd. We have a vibrant Journey Kids program. And if one of your kids needs to go in there, I don't know that, I think we're good in here. But we're going to talk because this is the place to talk about this. The church cannot my allergies are kicking me today. The church cannot be silent on this. This is our topic. We have the truth about these things, and we need to speak them. Paul wrote a letter to a church that was a hot mess. It's a church in Corinth. And the letter that we're going to be looking at is called 1 Corinthians. And to know the background of what he's talking about, you have to understand the culture that he's writing to. See, Corinth was a trade city that was deeply influenced by the Greek culture and Greek prophecy. They had tons of temples in their city. There were 12 of them, and one of them was a special temple. It was the most prominent temple, the temple of the goddess Aphrodite, the goddess of love. At one time in their culture, there were over 1,000 prostitutes that served in the temple of Aphrodite. And sex was celebrated as part of their religion. It was so prominent in their culture that, you know, the language sodomy, to sodomize, taken from the city Sodom, right? Sex was so prominent in their culture that there's writing that people actually use the word to Corinthize, meant to have sexual, immoral relationships. This is the environment that the church was living in. This is their city. These are their friends. This is what they are coming out of. And Paul writes to them about how they are now to live in view of it. And he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, starting in verse 12, he says, quoting them, "I have the right to do anything, you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything." And Paul says, "But I will not be mastered by anything." Paul, as he starts this conversation, is addressing their mistaken mindset of what it means to live in freedom with Christ. And he wants them to hear very clearly that your freedom does not give you license to put yourself back in prison. There's a famous proverb, Proverbs 26:11, that says, "As a dog returns to its vomit, so a fool returns to his folly." Like, this is what Paul is wanting them to hear. He continues in verse 13. He says, "You say, food for the stomach and stomach for the food, and God will destroy them both. But the body, however, is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body." What he means here is this: sex is way more than just an appetite to feed. It has way more implications than just addressing a desire that is in your body. In fact, it has direct impact on your union with Christ because Christ is in your body. Listen to how he continues this conversation, verse 14 through 17. "By his power, God raised the Lord from the dead, and he will also raise us. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ himself? Shall I then take the members of Christ and unite them with a prostitute?" He's talking about their culture. He's talking about how they live. He's talking about their current moment. He says, "Never. Do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body? For it is said, the two will become one flesh. But whoever is united with the Lord is one with him in spirit. You see, verse 16b, the two will become one flesh. That's our text again. It's again, the Genesis 2, verse 24 text is again being quoted in our scriptures. And that one flesh thing, we talked about it last week. Remember the word flesh, the Greek word sarx. It can be translated as flesh or body, or even sometimes translated as humanity. Did I say that right? Humanity. To have flesh is to be human. Like that's the language here. And so the two becoming one flesh, it gives this picture of two individual humanities being melded together to create something brand new. Quite literally, two humans creating a new humanity because of their union together. It is the melding and the intimacy that happens physically. It is a melding and intimacy that happens emotionally. And don't forget that it is a melding and an intimacy that happens spiritually. Because he reminds us that in our bodies, we are one with Christ. His Spirit is one with us. He continues, verse 18 through 20. He says, flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body. But whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. Paul's using this language. You can see Corinth and these 12 different temples that are in the city, and then this one temple of Aphrodite where all of this sexual stuff is going on, and they call it worship. And Paul is saying, you have the better temple. It's your flesh. And it is the temple of the Lord. It is where Christ lives. And in that temple, you have been given a gift to be able to have union not only with Christ, but also union with another person in a way that is holy and sanctified. His language here is quite literally, do not turn the house of God that is your body into a whorehouse. And don't make Christ, who comes with you, into one of their clients. His language is really clear. This isn't new conversation. This isn't new territory because Christians are now functioning in sexual ways that are different than ever before with God's people. Like this is what God has always intended. With a deeper, fuller expression, because now the Spirit of God is in us and we have even greater fulfillment of these things. But from Genesis 2 forward, this is what God intended in relationship between a man and woman, and it's what he intended for sex. You remember the commands, right? The 10 commands. The one about sex. Exodus chapter 20, verse 14. You shall not, what? You shall not commit adultery. What that deeply, quite literally means is you shall not sexually betray your one flesh relationship with your husband or wife. When we get deeper into the Torah, that's Exodus, the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the law of God. When we get into Leviticus, God gives detailed instruction about what that is and what to stay away from and how this needs to go. In Leviticus chapter 18, there is a list of things. And then you get to Leviticus chapter 20, and there are punishments listed for this list of things. And I'm not going to deal with the punishments. I'm going to just deal with the list. But listen to how it starts. Leviticus 18, verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, I am the Lord your God." Now God is dealing with them in this moment by reminding them, and God does this often with his people, reminding them, I am yours, you are mine, live in view of that. You are not your own. It's similar language to what Paul just told us, right? You were bought with a price. You are not your own. Live in view of this relationship. So what does he tell them to do? You must not do as they do in Egypt. Okay? Please, please, please hear this. I can't help but stand up at this point. The world is broken and in desperate need of salvation. It always has been. And God has always been working to bring hope and freedom and life from the very beginning. When the fall happened and God kept us from eating the tree of life and living forever in this broken state, like God has forever, from that point forward, moved throughout history to reconcile humanity to himself. This world is broken and it is going to do things that are not of God. And our measurement in our lives and how we function is not in view of how they are functioning and what is normal for them. Do not do as they do in Egypt. Or, it later says, do not do as they do in the land that you're about to go into. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know your God. He says, do not follow their practices. You must obey my laws and be careful to follow my decrees. I am the Lord your God. Verse 5, keep my decrees and laws, for the person who obeys them will live by them. I am the Lord. What he means there is you will really live. Like, the life that I long for you to have, you will have if you follow my ways. Like, I have blessing for you here. Cool. So I'm going to chase a rabbit for just a second. And I'm going to get back because there's some things I really want to get to. But God is not holding out on you. Like these laws about sex and what he wants and what he's designed. He's not holding out on you. He's not keeping a gift from you. He is saying, if you follow my ways, you're going to have the best thing ever. You can't improve on it. Okay. So he gets to this list in Leviticus that God's given Moses, and it's an interesting list because what it starts in is kind of strange. Like it goes verse after verse after verse after verse for quite a while in dealing in specific relationships of don't do that, don't go there. Let me list them for you. He says, don't have sex with a close relative. And then he deals with all these incest kinds of relationships. He says, don't have sex with your mom, with your father's wife, with your sister, with your niece, with your stepsister, with your aunt, with your daughter-in-law, with your brother's wife. And then he expands it a little bit. Don't have sex with a woman and her daughter. Not a good idea. My nose is running. Can't breathe today. Don't have sex. That's not a good idea either. 6 of them, no. Don't have sex with your wife's sister. We've seen that in Scripture. Not a good idea, right? So what's going on here? Why so many kind of incestuous relationship? Like, why does the list start there? Well, here's a window into some of this. Number one, the Israelites, when they're going into Canaan, they're about to enter before they get this. They get this teaching before they go in. They are told not to intermarry with the Canaanites, right? So they cannot pick from these people. They have to pick from within, right? We know that from Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 3. They also were told, when you intermarry, you're intermarrying with each other should not transfer your land to a different tribe. That's in Numbers chapter 36. Basically, like, keep it within the family, right? Your land and the control of things, like you need to kind of pick from this circle. And so their options go from here to here, right? And so he starts with the instructions of, but do not pick there, because that's not okay, right? You're going to be picking from this smaller circle, but do not pick from within your own household, because it would destroy the one flesh relationship that this household is built on. When it gets through with that, it picks up and it lifts a broader instruction in verse 20. And it says, do not have sexual relations with your neighbor's wife and defile her. That's the broad instruction. In other words, don't pick from within your own household, whether it's a relative or not, right? And don't pick from someone who's already been picked. They're already one flesh with someone, that you would defile her. And then it also talks about him, like she's not available anymore. And then God ends this conversation with a couple of other instructions. He says, do not have sex with a man as one would with a woman. This is an abomination. Then he says, do not have sex with an animal as you would with a woman. This is detestable, or a perversion of a confusing of the natural order of things. With those two statements, God is basically saying, you are not to take the one flesh gift that I have made for you and turn it into something detestable. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother, be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. That is what God intended. Jesus spoke of these things. In the Sermon on the Mount, he turns and he quotes the command. You've heard it said, don't commit adultery. But I tell you, anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in their heart. You see, Jesus is not just focused on our actions. He's focused on our relationship with God. He's focused on where this is rooted and where life actually exists. Proverbs 4:23 says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Quite literally, the translation is, springs of life flow from your heart. Jesus continues that conversation and he says, guard your heart so much that if your eye is causing you to sin, like just cut it out. So you'd rather go into heaven blind than chase that down. If your hand's causing you to sin, like cut it off. Like guard your heart here. Because this is where life is. You remember this from last week, right? When Eve was standing there with Adam, and I told you the first sin was his inappropriate passivity because he didn't man up, he didn't post up for her, right? But you remember how this went. Like she saw the tree that she wasn't supposed to eat from. She desired it with her heart. And that's where trouble comes. And it turned her into taking and eating it. So, Journey, this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where I want to move us and encourage us moving forward. Let's use that model. Let's use Jesus' coaching and instruction. Like, let's guard our hearts. And how do we do that? We'll use the same model that Eve had. We're going to deal with our eyes, with our heart, and with our hands. So here we go. We need to first make sure that we don't feed our eyes with sexual immorality. Let's just be clear. Men and women, boys and girls, porn will rot your soul. It will destroy your one flesh relationship. It will affect everything that you touch. Jesus says, if you look at a woman and lust after her, you've already committed adultery. Your heart is already there. We need to guard our eyes at whatever cost it takes. I've walked with some guys that have brick phones or flip phones that do not have internet anymore because it is keeping them off of it. Like whatever it takes. Number two, and we have whole series sermons on porn, and we can deal with that later, but let's just start there. The second one is, you know those cheeseburger gazes, right? You know what I'm talking about, right? You're walking around town, or you're at a pool, or you're just in a mall, and women, you can do this too. I know it. I've seen it. but I'll just deal with the men. A woman comes up and she's dressed kind of like for attention, and like, okay, well, let's, and you just like, you see, you look, and then you look, you really look, right? And it's this look that you kind of turn her into a cheeseburger that you just want to consume. It's a cheeseburger gaze, right? Stop it. Like, don't do that. It will turn your heart to places that are not okay. Jesus wants to save us from the not okay. Just bounce your eyes. And here's the thing. You are, and I'm talking to the men again, you are hardwired to notice. You will notice a beautiful woman. And some of you women are hardwired too. It's just an extra gift. Okay? You will note, noticing is not this thing. Don't feed it and turn it into desire. When you notice, say, oh, that's pretty, whoop, and move on. Don't turn them into a cheeseburger. And number 3, and this is men and women equally, we need to guard our entertainment choices. The books that we read, the movies that we watch. And let me give you a little guide here. If you are consuming entertainment with the desire for sexual arousal, you're in the wrong place. You're moving into the pit of hell that Jesus is trying to keep you from. You're polluting your heart in a way that will harm you and your one flesh relationship. So let's talk about our heart. Number 1, take captive every thought. 2 Corinthians 10, 3 through 5 says that we are able to demolish strongholds. That we have, because the Spirit of God is in us, we are able to demolish the strongholds that are coming at us. And he says, take captive every thought and make them obedient to Christ. When something comes up, in the name of Jesus, rebuke that. You have the power because he is in you. The one who is in you is stronger than the one who is in the world. Name it and take control over it. Number 2, please. And some of you ladies, guys that aren't married yet, learn this now. Have nothing hidden. I'm going to say it again. Have nothing hidden from your spouse. Ever. Your internet history should never be deleted. Your text messages should never go unnoticed by them. You are a transparent, one flesh union. Live in transparency. And one way to do that is a third piece, is have no isolated relationships that your spouse is not a part of. And here's what I mean. Don't have relationships online or in person with the other sex that your spouse does not know about or is not a part of. So those are the eyes and the heart. Now the hand. These should be really simple, but they need to be said. Keep your hands off what don't belong to you. If it's not your one flesh, you can't touch it. I mean, it feels like we're in kindergarten, but we need to say that, right? Second point, and we need to say this too. Put your hands on what belongs to you. If you are not inappropriately touching in public, start doing it, please. I don't know how many times we're in Walmart and I will get me one of those, and Kristen's like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "Nobody's watching. That's bought and paid for." You are mine, I am yours, and we're going to celebrate this thing. Put your hands on each other. Because of time, I'm not going to read the rest. I'm just going to tell you what it says, and I'm going to coach you into a couple of things about celebrating this relationship, because the church needs to celebrate sex. It is a really, really good gift from God. Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verse 1 says it's good for a man not to have sexual relationship with a woman. What he is talking about is not that it's nasty and dirty and you don't need to do that. He's like, you're already full. You are a complete human being if you're not married. You're not a lacking expression of Christianity if you're single. Live in that. Live in your freedom in that. Live in these guidelines with him in that. And then he follows up and he says, but because there's so much sexual immorality in the world, every man should have his own wife and every woman her own husband. Like, you guys can't control yourselves. Go have sex with your spouse. That's what he's saying. And then he goes all the way forward and he says, the wife should fulfill her marital duty with her husband. And then he follows it up and says the husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, which actually in this culture would have been unheard of. For him to have equal responsibility in the sexual relationship for her, like in their culture, she's meat. She is property. And Paul is saying, as you engage in this sexual relationship, make sure that you are serving her. Verse 5, he finishes by saying, do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Like fast from sex so you can pray, and then come back together so that you won't be tempted and lose self-control. Offer your bodies to each other as a gift. And I'm going to land the plane here. I'm 7 minutes over, but this is the best sermon ever. So let me land the plane here. 3 things. Your sex life ought to have 3. If you're married, if you're not, you are one with Christ. Deal with it. Celebrate it. Seriously, celebrate your singleness. If you're married, your sex life ought to have 3 expressions in it. Number 1, you ought to have fun together. There ought to be laughter and joy and experimentation. Your body is a playground. Driving down the back roads, right? Doing 15 and a 30. I ain't in no hurry. Right? Right? Like, let's have fun together. Aaron enjoyed my singing. The second piece of our sexual relationship ought to be intimacy. Like there's a part of this where you come together and it's about love and affection. Like gazing in each other's eyes and just bonding together. There's a third, well, before I move on, like enjoying being naked together, touching and celebrating that without a race toward orgasm. That's what I mean when I talk about intimacy. The third, like nurture passion. The longing and desire for each other. Like, seriously, nurture fantasies about each other. Figure out what you guys like, and surprise them with it. This is a gift by God to be celebrated. And it's really, really good.